So my name is Father John Byer. I'm a Cistercian monk in Our Lady of Dallas, which is a monastery in Irving, Texas. And we are a community of about 26 members, and we have 24 solemnly professed and 2 novices. I'm also the vocations director, so I track those numbers relatively closely. We've got an exciting life. Our demographics here in the monastery are very positive, so we have a lot of young members, thanks be to God, and we're all in on our preparatory school. We have an all-boys school here from grades 5 to 12. It's where I teach full-time, and some 15, 16 monks also teach full-time there. And then a number of us also teach at the University of Dallas, which is kind of a sister institution insofar as both the monastery and the University of Dallas grew up together in collaboration. I also adjunct there at UD in theology, and I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, Marcus and I have a number of questions and observations related to guilt and responsibility. Maybe a good way to start, though, would be for me to quote you back to you. This is from an email that you sent me.
Sure.
So you wrote, when I talk to my students about slavery and racism, for example, and the way Catholics were sometimes sadly complicit, I try to lead toward a discussion about our attitude toward the past.
Hmm.
Should we purchase our purity today by scapegoating those quote unquote bad Catholics in the past and so wash our hands of the whole problem? Or should we drag ourselves through the mud by quote unquote apologizing and accepting white or Catholic guilt as if we were the perpetrators? Is there a way to accept responsibility for remedying a situation without accepting responsibility for having created it, i.e., to have moral responsibility without guilt? It seems to me that the Catholic understanding of solidarity in Adam and Eve, and then especially in Christ and the Church, does exactly that. I have a responsibility toward my neighbor, not because I personally put him in poverty, but because he is my neighbor in poverty. Christ's insistence upon the shared nature, fallenness, and destiny of all human beings, as well as his identification with us all, whatever you do to the least of these, seems to me to justify moral responsibility toward everyone, at least in principle, but without the irrational self-loathing and resentment that seems common today.
I'm glad you quoted that. I spent some time thinking that one out, and it comes from experience, like I mentioned in the quote of teaching. And also in my own heart, trying to wrestle with these things. Like I grew up Catholic, cradle Catholic, didn't know a whole lot about the faith, or certainly not the history of the Catholic Church and racism and slavery and things like that. And I'm still learning, and it's a difficult task to learn about, I think, because there's a lot of agendas and ideology in the literature. There are some folks who seem to want to exonerate very quickly and make sure that things don't look terrible when sometimes they really do look terrible. But then there are other people who want to make things look more dramatic than they might be, even suggest radical doctrinal errors, and maybe even use that example of slavery as a doctrinal change in the church to now use it as a premise to argue for other doctrinal changes. So it's a very, in my experience at least, fraught literature to try to navigate through. But if I'm holding on to what seems to be pretty sure, there is a very sad story. If we just take, one of the easiest examples for me, American slavery and the Catholic Church's complicitness with it. There are religious orders and bishoprics and so forth that were involved in that. Obviously, we need a lot of charity when we analyze any culture, and try to certainly not judge with any definitive moral judgment. Remember, there, but for the grace of God, go I. It's also important to wonder, how will future ages judge our own when we have scourges like abortion and other things like that? We can feel that, well, it's so easy to understand why I am not, as dramatically opposing something like abortion, and then maybe think about how, oh, what were those Catholics doing back in the 19th century? Why weren't they more up in arms? Isn't it obvious? And in a particular case that I look at with my students is Father Augustine Tolton. So a man whose cause for canonization his process is being opened, and he's a very exciting figure. He's a very beautiful biography, the son of slaves, and the first openly Black priest There were a pair of brothers before him whose skin tone allowed them to pass for white. And so even though they had African American ancestry, the society accepted them through as if they were white. But Father Tolton was the first who was clearly Black and who was able to serve as a Black priest in the United States. And I go with my students and I point out to them that he was not accepted in any American seminary. There was a priest who tried to help him find a seminary, but no American seminary would accept him. And that, for me, that's sad. That's profoundly sad and embarrassing. But then I think, gosh, what's the nature of that embarrassment? You know, I didn't do that, right? And then my students do also, when we feel like, oh shoot, like I really loved it, Father John, when you were teaching us about the saints and about how awesome Thomas Aquinas is and faith and reason and everything. And it's like, yeah, that stuff's awesome. And then, oh shoot, here's this belongs to us too. And it's like, well, with the same kind of sense of pride that I have in belonging to the body to which Saint Thomas Aquinas belongs, I have a certain understandable sense of embarrassment. I realize I belong to the same body that had those folks who excluded Father Tolton. Um, Thanks be to God, we belong to a big body. And when one member can be ideologically sick in some way, there's another member of the body that could be ideologically healthy. And in this case, that's what you see. Father Augustine Tolton was able to go to Rome, the mother church, and receive a seminary formation and then come sent back as a missionary priest. So that's kind of a beautiful story of where belonging to the Catholic Church and this universal time and space allows the different members of the body to nourish each other, and weep with those who weep and strengthen those who need strengthening. So in reflecting on this experience, Augustine Tolton for me is a great example, but there are others one could look at where you feel in yourself a sense of responsibility and you're trying to navigate that. I try to discourage my students from an irrational conclusion, as if they were the ones who excluded Father Tolton. That just doesn't make sense. And so I don't think we should apologize in a way that accepts personal guilt. But as I try to say in this quote, we must feel a moral responsibility, not only for what I personally have done wrong, but because of the nature of reality. And reality implicates me. And there are things that I should feel responsible for, not because of my agency, but just because of the nature of being, reality. And Jesus really makes that clear. He tells us things about ourselves. Look, you are all belonging to one nature. You are all from Adam and Eve. You are all the same, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of the same parents. And just like you would look at your own brother and sister and feel a sense of responsibility because of that shared identity, so must we as Catholics, given what our Creator has told us about our familial unity, look upon each other as brothers and sisters. But even more than that, we also know through revelation that the reason that we have these sinful tendencies and the reason that we fall so often is because we all share a common moral illness. We call that original sin. That something happened at the beginning of our history, of our family, and through whatever mechanism we can try to describe as philosophically and theologically, we share that illness, all of it. And so the same tendencies towards sin that are in my brother, the same tendencies in myself. And we all want to rise together. And so I should have so much compassion and forgiveness upon him when he sins and ask for the same, because we're both suffering from the same thing. But then even more dramatically, Jesus also tells us that what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And he insists that our sense of responsibility for the other not only should be, oh, he's in poverty, I should help my brother like a good Samaritan, but that Jesus Christ has identified himself with him and wants to be served in him. So my path back to God passes through my solidarity with the poor. And if I feel embarrassment over what happened to Father Tolton, it's very appropriate because it is totally in consonant with the Catholic faith that I profess and the body to which I belong. But again, not because I did it, but because I should have a sense of indignation that should happen, and I should want to run out and meet wherever Father Augustine Tolton is today and help. The last thing I'll kind of add to this is something I don't have in that quote, but I think also kind of makes sense. So St. John Paul II kind of famously went on an apology tour, right? Like there were many different things for which he apologized. And so that I think adds one more level of complexity to this. St. John Paul II apologized for like what the church did with Galileo, for mistakes about crusades and for Inquisition and for different things that in history we would say that was bad. We wish we hadn't done that. That was the result of sinful motives. So we should, in some sense, be ready to apologize if St. John Paul II was ready to do it. But again, I don't think St. John Paul II was apologizing because of personal guilt, as if he had done those things. He was apologizing because of his sense of solidarity with the body. And I can imagine, as an analogy, a parent at a playground, if their child, say, goes up and hits some other child, the parent wouldn't apologize to the child who was hit or to the parent of that child who was hit as if that parent had himself or herself done the hitting. You would apologize out of solidarity with the child, that this child is I take responsibility for this child. And I, apologize to you and indicate that what happened here shouldn't have happened. And I will do what I should do as a parent to grow that child so that it doesn't happen again. And maybe the last point, if we want to stay on this just for a quick moment, is that the temptation, as I put in the quote, to kind of purchase our purity by scapegoating the past. Like it could be very easy, to solve this problem of our sins in the past. By saying, oh, well, those are the bad Catholics. Things are different today. We're much more modern, progressive, in touch with the way things should be. And it's like, whoa, 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 like that kind of scapegoating really has no place in Catholic faith. It betrays the truth that I stand very much under the same sickness as those people did in the 19th century. And I need to have more solidarity than that if I want to be wise.
Father John, I was wondering if we could wind back to some of the distinctions you were drawing in that response, in particular, the distinction between having a responsibility to remedy a wrong versus having kind of culpability or kind of personal responsibility for having performed the wrongs in question.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about distinctions like that recently, especially in the context of how to think about lamentation in the face of the kinds of wrongs and injustices that we're discussing. And I wonder, do you think that there's room here for pointing to the idea of chosen versus unchosen obligations, that could help shed light on how Catholics and non-Catholics can respond constructively to some of these problems? Often, you hear about these ideas in the context of how to care for the most vulnerable. You mentioned the unborn earlier in your remarks. We can think also of the infirm, people who suffer with disabilities, or the elderly, right? The idea that situations like these call out to us, either in justice or in generosity, to respond to them, whether or not you can trace it back to a specific choice I made to enter into this contractual arrangement or to enter into this covenant, right? That these are sites of unchosen obligation, or maybe an unchosen opportunity to do a work of mercy. Do you think that those sorts of concepts can help us shed some light here?
Oh, absolutely. And I think thinking about that will drive you to some really deep anthropological questions where you see the relevance of Catholic faith or whatever else you believe. So I could easily imagine like an Enlightenment political philosophical tradition where, we're autonomous individuals and our relationship is on the basis of a social contract. And if I didn't violate this contract, don't come to me with your problems. If you're in bad shape, I'm sorry, so to speak, but I'm not really, in the sense that I don't feel that I need to do something because I did not enter a contract with you or I kept up my side of the bargain. But Catholic faith poses a very different anthropology where we are just necessarily in relationships to people, in different ways depending on our proximity and all the complex network of our relationships. But we are in principle in relationship with every other human being. And then in a particular way with all those baptized. So you could call that an unchosen obligation. I would like to think of it as ultimately, insofar as one appropriates his Catholic faith, it becomes a chosen obligation. on the model of Jesus Christ, who chose his solidarity with us in order to have this exchange of gifts where he took upon himself our sin, interestingly, not in the way that made him personally culpable, right? But still took on our sin such that he identified with it to the point of being able even to offer expiation for us. So there's a dramatic taking on of guilt without being personally culpable that's sort of at the root of Catholic faith. But the more particular point I wanted to make here in response to your distinction of chosen, unchosen is that we should hopefully, at least Catholics, want to embrace this kind of obligation, following Jesus Christ, who chose it. And it shouldn't be like this feet dragging, I guess I'm obliged because doggone it, I'm Catholic. It's like, no. As the Father sent me, so I send you. And like, that's me that he's sending out on this mission of reconciliation. And so I'm running into these moments to choose solidarity as a positive good.
So, Father John, I want to stay on this theme of guilt and responsibility and ask a couple of questions that might come from a more, say, politically conservative perspective. I'm going to kind of go through a couple of notes that I wrote, some of which are just statements, but there is also a question or two. But really, I would just like you to listen to it and respond to it as you see fit.
Sure.
So you have made the point, and this point has been made by many people of many different ideological persuasions and religious persuasions, that you can be morally responsible for your neighbor's misfortune without being to blame for his misfortune. But what I want to get into now is, in what ways are we responsible, and what are the limits of that responsibility? So suppose first that a person or family or community is making the most of their potential and they're still suffering or in need. Well, it seems to me in that case, the responsibility is to relieve the suffering and supply what is needed, period. But now suppose a person or a family or a community is not making the most of their potential, and they are suffering or in need because of that. In this case, it seems to me the responsibility is to relieve acute distress, but otherwise to assist the person or family or community in making the most of their potential. So to give an example that is relevant, I think, one of the main ways in which communities in America today, some communities in America today, don't make the most of their potential is by having high rates of fatherlessness in the home. Our responsibility, arguably, is not to substitute for absent fathers in those communities in perpetuity, but to help those communities rebuild the family.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another issue, which is, even if individuals, families, and communities do make the most of their potential, so let's assume individuals, families, communities, they are making the most of their potential. They're still going to make different choices about what to do,
Mm-hmm.
what to prioritize, and they're not going to perform equally in every domain.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those facts, the fact that people, even at their highest potential, make different choices and don't perform equally in every domain, both of those facts lead to unequal outcomes, which I would call innocent or just disparities.
Mm-hmm.
But these innocent or just disparities are a problem because inequality is experienced as a kind of suffering or misfortune.
Mm-hmm.
Individuals who see other individuals or groups doing better than they are doing, or better than their group is doing, suffer as a result often, even if that inequality is fair, if it's innocent, if it's just.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question I'm going to close this passage with is, how do we respond to those feelings of misfortune?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm just taking a few notes to try to
Of course, I
get as
threw a
much
lot
as I
at you.
can. No, and I think you hit a really good nerve there. Really good nerve. So let me go, and if I say anything too afoul, you stop me. So one thing I would say is it does not make sense to me to think that all difference is injustice. So both from Catholic faith and I think from sound political philosophy, we should recognize a legitimate diversity with respect to our different roles in the body politic. I think Plato's pretty clear on this. You could object, certainly we don't want everything that Plato says in the Republic to be true of our body politic, but I think one point he makes that seems to me pretty sound is that there are going to be different roles, and people should be allowed to specialize. And we shouldn't think that the ideal state is where everybody has the exact same income and everybody has the exact same job and everybody has the exact same vacation time and so forth. There is a diversity of person and, interest, and, diversity of need also. Moreover, and I think here, maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys could tell me, maybe this is also something that you could find in the philosophers, but I know for sure it's in like an Thomas Aquinas, where, the diversity of gift leads to higher gifts, where if you've got more than I do, your ability to like help me is creating another positive good that the Father in heaven wants, namely our solidarity and love. And so, it seems very provident that God would allow disparity precisely in order to facilitate exchange in higher spiritual goods like love. When I don't need a big house, but it's awesome when the guy with the big house hosts the party and gives this generous gift and like brings the community together. We don't all need big houses, because isn't it beautiful when we don't have this pretension for autonomy, but we are able to rely upon each other for greater gifts. So not all difference is injustice, but certainly there can be differences that we would want to remedy because they might be unjust, but not all difference is unjust. And certainly materially speaking, I don't think all difference is unjust. Moreover, so here's another point. I would say certainly, and that sort of follows to the second point, that equality of outcome can't be the goal then. You would commit in some sense a new injustice if you tried to flatten and equalize everybody in all metrics. So that can't be the goal. And one potentially kind of scandalous for some people thought is that God clearly doesn't want it that way. Like, God gives his graces differently. Even morally speaking, we are not all promised an equal outcome. It's strange for people to think about that. But, and if somebody sounds like, well, that doesn't sound Catholic, it's like, well, Mary was immaculately conceived. I was not. There's a difference in outcome there. And in God's providence, he wanted both of us, though. And I hope to play my part and to reach the measure of holiness and my role in the body of Christ that God wills for me. Mary already got first place, so to speak, in the realm of mere mortals. By the gift of Jesus Christ, she was given all the gifts she was, and she played her role beautifully. And we all have her to thank as for her fiat and her role as mother of Jesus, and through him, mother of all of us. I have a different role, and it doesn't involve, sad for me, being tota pulchra, and full of grace. So even if God is willing to allow that for me, then I think we need to be prepared also for a disparity of outcome, and just rejoice in the ways that those disparities lead to collaboration and higher goods that I tried to mention earlier. Now, in response to some other things that I understood from you, yeah, if say it's fatherlessness. So if a particular community, and to some extent that's the entire American community, I know in African American communities it's a higher percentage to be sure, but the crisis in the family is affecting us all, and so it's obviously not a moral poverty that afflicts one race exclusively, to be sure. So if that is a thing, we obviously need to recognize that you don't solve that simply by throwing money at it. And if you want to help someone with such a profound thing, you need to kind of go all in. And I think that a lot of the solutions today that are being proposed, I mean, I shouldn't pretend like I'm an expert on these, but if I'm just speaking very simply, if it's just more about subsidies and more, programs that would help facilitate a kind of life that substitutes, as you said, for the father, where now he's no longer needed in order to make a functioning home, that can't be the solution. We might need in a crisis situation, to be sure, to find whatever material substance we need to help a mother who's single and has children. But we do not want to become enablers of what is objectively a poverty for the human condition. Children need a father and a mother. Spouses need each other. We were just made for that. That's, I think, an anthropological datum that you could take philosophically and certainly theologically, that we were not meant to raise children in isolation, and that the men and women who raise children have complementary gifts that not only enrich the lives of their children, but each other. And so we would want to have that as the goal, explicitly so, honestly so. And when we're trying to help people, we shouldn't patronize them by saying, oh, all you need is this. No, we should recognize the depth of their poverty and say, the human experience involves like a functioning, happy family. And it's a sad thing worth weeping over, lamenting, to Marcus's point. And let's not pretend it's not a real problem and just say all you need is just a little bit more money. You heroic woman, heroic indeed, but crying nonetheless. And we need to have enough respect for her to admit the depth of that poverty and then go all in to help her. Now, maybe with that all in, I've kind of reached the last point that I took out from what you were saying. How do you measure when and where you're responsible? Because like obviously no one individual can feel responsible for the 7 billion or however many people there are on the planet. Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think that involves a very important readiness to pray, frankly. I'm not sure how other traditions will do this. Any tradition that tries to solve this problem on the level of like universal principles alone, I think will get into some kind of sloppy calculus at the end and be unable to describe why exactly they're helping here but not here. I think only a calculus that stems from a sense of personal mission, that is like, that God wants me to do X and not Y, where I've prayed and I've come to a judgment, informed in conscience that my mission is over here. And I can't explain that apodictically through some like universal principled syllogistic reasoning that tells you formally why I'm going here and not here. At the end of the day, I'm certainly involving principles, but I'm also involving the life of prayer in the sense of my own mission and vocation. We could do that for worse. That doesn't exonerate all of us. Sometimes, our discernment's really bad and we're going to be standing before God, about how successfully we have followed his will in our lives. But I think that mode of thinking is really the only right one. Because it's only then that you'll be able to realize that I am not Jesus Christ or the liberator of all human beings. And so I cannot assume personal responsibility, never mind personal guilt, for the total good of 7 billion people. But I also can't do nothing. And so I fall somewhere in between as a member of his mystical body. And I need to see who is in my area, what are my talents, who is it that God wants me to put in my area. Like who is my neighbor? The Samaritan made the man his neighbor when he passed by and saw him and then integrate him into his solidarity. So, what are my talents? Who's near to me? Who should be near to me? Whom do I need to go out and seek? We need to be thinking in that kind of personal discernment in order to answer that last question.
One quick follow-up before I go to you, Marcus. This is rewinding a little bit, Father John, but I really would like to hear what you have to say about this. It seems to me, judging from our current political discourse, that our society is not that uncomfortable with the idea that individuals differ in their interests and abilities. Our society is also not that uncomfortable with the fact that some people have a lot of money and a lot of others don't. The thing that seems to make people really uncomfortable or that people seem to find very objectionable is that groups should differ from each other. Especially in terms of power, resources, and status. So it's not, so the focus is not so much on individual difference or on economic inequality as such, but instead that certain groups should have a higher share of the elite power, status, and resources than others. And I was wondering if you had any further reflections on that particular subject. And again, I bring it up because it seems to me that this is really the core of DEI, actually.
So that's a good question. And I'll try to make sense of it. So I think that I can understand the concern for group difference if it's based in like a concrete real group. And so if we take race, for example, I would draw a big distinction between a community that suffers because of a history of slavery and disenfranchisement, and how this is a concrete group or body that has in fact borne particular wounds through its particular history, and therefore calls out for a particular response. That's very different than an abstraction that if we just say, skin color, and it doesn't matter whether you were part of that community that suffered from this history, or if you were born on the other side of the world and you happen to have the same skin color and now you belong to this group. Like that for me is a group that is much less serviceable in this kind of, discernment process. And, to get concrete, so I don't consider myself at all an expert in law or the Supreme Court or whatever, but to me, the decision about affirmative action makes a lot of sense. So far as I understand it, you should not discriminate on the basis of race. That's a good thing, right? And it's also not helpful to do so if your understanding of group is simply skin color. Because, to take the proverbial Prince of Egypt who applies to an Ivy League school or whatever over here, it shouldn't count as a social justice victory if this person who has incredible wealth and incredible background, all kinds of tutors, who knows what, in his foreign land, and then is able to come to an elite American institution. And it shouldn't be considered a social justice victory if just because of his skin color he was admitted. It would be a much greater social justice victory if we have someone who does come from this concrete community, who is suffering, is in poverty, and we're able to elevate him in a way that makes him successful through participation in that Ivy League and beyond. So my understanding of the Supreme Court decision was that you can't just click a race box and then consider that a legitimate use of affirmative action, but you can read someone's story, someone's concrete story, and say, here's a person that we can help through uplift. This is a person who has talent that can allow them to succeed here. Maybe they won't be the brightest star academically, but that doesn't matter. They can succeed here. And what is important for us as an institution is not just to have everybody with a 4.0 GPA here, but is to actually contribute to the common good, because a university should have a mission beyond its own self-perpetuation, at least I believe. It should have a mission to contribute to the common good. And they could, I think, totally legitimately identify as part of their participation in promoting the common good, helping to uplift a group or a community that, for whatever reason, historically has been put in a position to need that uplift. So that's how I think I would respond to the group question.
In a slightly different direction, Father John, I did have one last question I wanted to share with you on this theme we've been on moral responsibility. When we think about remedying the kinds of social wounds that DEI advocates point to, in the Catholic tradition, we talk about the works of mercy, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And it is important that they're works of mercy, right? They're not works of justice. They're not works of moral obligation or something like that. There is that distinction very deep between justice and charity, or justice and mercy, justice and grace. Or in secular terms, we might talk about the distinction between the virtue of justice and the virtue of generosity, or doing what's morally owed versus doing what's supererogatory, right? And I think there are deep reasons why we want to make that distinction and preserve that distinction as Catholics, that we also want to call people beyond just meeting that bar of what's simply morally required, to stretch beyond that to a kind of generosity and a kind of self-giving, giving till you feel the pinch, which is in imitation of Christ, certainly. At the same time, I can imagine a third party looking at those distinctions and being insistent about that distinction and thinking, well, gosh, isn't that awfully convenient? It can be a way of really getting a lot of folks off the hook if you insist that even though there are these social problems, it isn't a matter of moral obligation for anyone in particular to pick up the tab, so to speak. Obviously, I want to be able to defend that distinction between justice and mercy, justice and charity. I wonder, Father John, in your own reflections, if you have any thoughts on how to bring that vocabulary to these sorts of problems.
Yeah, that's another good question. You guys ask really good questions, and I hope I'm helpful. I would say one really important principle, at least from the gospel is that love is sort of a commandment. Like the way Jesus speaks about it is as a commandment. The first of the greatest commandment is love God, whole heart, mind, and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus, on the night he's betrayed, he gives this new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. However, here's the paradox is that love, if genuinely given, is, as you described, using that beautiful phrase, a self-gift. So it's not fulfilled in a kind of extrinsic obedience. It's not my conformity to a command outside of me. It has some measure of like internal propulsion, like it is a self-gift. I'm not accepting to be taken away from myself. I am the motive force of being given away. So there is something paradoxical about the nature of love. It is both an obligation and yet by definition must be free. The way I would reconcile that is that it's an obligation for only the reason for which God asks anything obligatory, namely it fulfills your highest freedom, like it fulfills your destiny. It is your beatitude. The Ten Commandments, the Beatitudes, like any law that God gives us is not something that we should experience as this like heteronomous, extrinsic compulsion that, okay, I guess. He's ultimately just describing to us the pattern of our beatitude. If you want to be happy, do this. It's like the commandment is the do this that comes after the premise, if you want to be happy. He's just telling to us our nature, telling to us our vocation, elevated by his grace. So I would say I can square that circle as a Catholic. I'm not sure how others would. I can imagine that there are other people who either deny the law, who say that, no, that's just not a commandment. Justice is a commandment, and they understand justice as simply, doing in some kind of equality, either of exchange or distribution or something like that. But then there's this whole realm of human activity that somehow doesn't fall under the auspices of justice, which is, just as an aside, a nice premise that I would like to poke holes in. But in any event, they quarantine out this other realm where it's free, and that is nicely the realm of mercy and love and these other kind of extras. That's a different vision. It's not the Catholic vision. I can see how people might find that comfortable. But if I were, speaking to them as a friend or pastoral, I would say, gosh, do you really think that's it? Like, when you look into your heart, don't you feel, maybe even think that you're made for that? Like, when you are doing that love thing, like, don't you somehow resonate more happily than if you were to say, no, I'm not giving that because I don't owe it to you, and I want to purchase something superfluous for myself. I would just probe people on that. Like, isn't the greatest thing we're about here love? Certainly a Catholic would think that, given what he understands God to be and what God has done for us and invited us into. But apart from that, I can understand that somebody might not buy that so obviously. But then I would just, speaking again as a Catholic and thinking what I think about human beings, try to tease out of them what I think is in there, this natural desire to live for love.
Thank you, Father John.
Father John, I'll ask my last question on guilt and responsibility. And this too is sort of a set of just reflections and questions, which I would just ask you to listen to and respond to as you see fit.
Yeah.
One way of looking at it might be that the first perspective I give is a more kind of politically left-wing perspective, and the second and third perspectives I give are a little more politically right-wing perspectives. But I want to give voice to these perspectives just to make sure that we're like covering the landscape of debate related to DEI and guilt and responsibility. So with that said, first, on the left-wing perspective, or part of the left-wing perspective, my understanding of many on the left is that in their view, if there is significant inequality between groups, primarily between racial groups and between the sexes, in the most high status areas of our society, it is unfair. It just is unfair. And we are all at a minimum responsible. And perhaps, according to some, we are all guilty. Maybe the thinking on that varies from person to person, thinker to thinker. in this connection, I think about the notion of systemic racism or of systemic sexism. I think that racism used to imply guilt. The way racism used to be used, it was a moral crime. If you were guilty of racism, or I'm sorry, if you committed racism, you were guilty. You were morally guilty. But now, increasingly, it only seems to imply responsibility. It almost seems to suggest absence of guilt, but responsibility nevertheless, because systemic racism has been defined as racism without racists, racism that adheres in institutions, even if the individuals operating that institution are not themselves racists. So in other words, the system has committed racism, but no individual within it. I don't know if it follows that the system is guilty or maybe just that the system is responsible. I have heard people on the left say things like, not everyone is guilty, but everyone is responsible. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Now, going to the political right, I just want to express a couple of perspectives that are arguably somewhat harsh or even combative seeming, but I bring them up because I know that these sentiments are held by many people on the right, and I want to know what your view of them is. So the view is this: while it is possible to be responsible for another's misfortune and to fail to acknowledge that, it is also possible to be unfairly held responsible for another's misfortune or perceived misfortune. And isn't it important to avoid both of those?
Mm-hmm.
We should take responsibility, all the responsibility we have, but we shouldn't take more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Going a little further, on the right side of the political spectrum, there's a lot of anger toward the left, in part because the right sees the left as placing too much blame and responsibility on society as a whole, or on whites, or on men, for group inequalities. The view on the right is that those on the left either overestimate society's blame and responsibility, or more cynically, some actors exploit society's guilt to pursue individual goals, group goals, or political goals. And so what I wrote here is, what light might Christian or Catholic theology shed for a person who's having those thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, a lot there. So I think I wrote enough notes to get all the parts, but you tell me if I dodge something accidentally. So you want me to do the left or the right first?
Whatever you want.
All right, I'll try to go in order that you gave them then. So you represented the left as complaining about an inequality between groups, and particularly race, sex, and how that is just by definition unfair. I think based on what we've said already, that yes, that can't be the case. That, I mean, at least if you're thinking, with the classical political philosophical tradition, or what I would think which is just a reasonable anthropology, you would recognize natural difference. And perhaps the easiest way to kind of point that out in our current milieu is like the transgender question and sports. If you just put some male body, even if you have tried through hormonal therapy and castration to really affect that body, it is just a fact that all through its development, it has been man. And even if it's a handicapped man, it is still a man. And it's going to perform on the whole different than a female. And you can, find the stories on the internet. There are certain media outlets which show them, others which seem never to want to show them, which show how in cycling and weightlifting and swimming and you name it, it's just so obvious that, a B+ male athlete, when he gets into a competition with fantastic female athletes, even if he's handicapped himself in different ways, he can win. And that seems really unfair. Unfair to the women. Not a victory for justice. But the premise of my judgment that being unfair is that I recognize a natural difference between male and female, and that natural difference is going to have effects. And as I think a natural right-thinking philosopher, not right in the political sense, but right in like the correct, reasonable sense, let alone as a Catholic, that those differences are things to be embraced. Those are really the diversity that is our strength. Like, that's not a platitude if you mean a real diversity. A difference in talent, in gift, that's offered up for the enrichment of the whole. And it could be very hard indeed to try to describe the male genius or the feminine genius. And I suspect, given the depth of the mystery of sexuality, that there's going to be a way in which it's somehow ineffable. I mean, at least St. Paul thinks that the mystery between a husband and a wife is a reflection of the love of God for his church in Christ. And so if that is a sacrament, I think we should expect that sexual difference and complementarity is going to reflect an ineffable mystery of God. And so we shouldn't be surprised if we feel poor in our language and it's like we can't stop by just saying, well, the man is assertive and the woman is tender. Like, that might get you some helpful things to say, but I'm also not going to be surprised if not everybody's settled after that, right? But nonetheless, there's something there, and it's a gift. And I mean, I have met men who were different from myself who have taught me more about masculinity and showed me how I'm not the paradigm of all masculinity. And so it's a big, beautiful reality, masculinity. And there's no one man who measures up in all way. But then all the more am I ready to see that the woman is different than I am. And there's certainly a diversity also within women. And I've had that blessed experience, even as a celibate man, of like being in the company of women and being like, there's something different here. And it's cool. I am enjoying this. And it would be profoundly unjust to just level all of that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what more I could say about that. So I don't think that's unjust at all to recognize natural difference. Of course, if there's an unjust difference, and there are those, we would want to remedy them. But to simply disqualify any difference, certainly on the basis of sex, seems to me irrational. And then thinking about racism, and so systemic racism, yeah, that is also my sense, that the way you describe that racism today, the way people use it, it at least sometimes no longer implies moral guilt. It just describes a situation into which you're born and you're now responsible. As a white, you are by definition now racist, not in the sense that you had slaves or you said some slur, but you are now put in a position of debt, of responsibility. That, I think, is a very nasty word for some of what I was trying to describe under the lens of moral responsibility. Like, I would agree, being an American, simply, that I assume responsibility for my country's history. All the more, as a Catholic, do I assume my responsibility, like JP2 did, for the history of this body. And so I would say that, yeah, I'm in some sense responsible, but I wouldn't use a dirty word like racism for that. I would use like my vocation to share in, either for an American, the beautiful dream of pursuing a more perfect union, or as a Catholic, of participating in the reconciling mission of Jesus Christ, bringing all things back to the Father. I can get up for those things, like that sounds exciting. And that's very different than, you're a racist and you owe, that is a very negative, and I think ultimately false, because it makes it all about guilt and of a kind, at least, or it doesn't recognize the nobility of our ties. So yeah, I don't like that shift. I would prefer a new word rather than using racism to describe our social responsibility. And so I would definitely let racism be racism, and then let's find a new word, which, on the basis of what I've been saying, can be much more exciting and positive and, illuminating for the full measure of our anthropology, as opposed to just some sin. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. And then the third point I understood you to make from the left about just how, maybe this wasn't a separate point, but I wrote it down in my notes as a separate point. Just, the possibility of systemic racism. So I try to have an open mind. I try to think, as broadly as I can. And to me, it seems like a lot of what is called systemic racism really isn't. It's just there's a sad diversity in outcome, which isn't baked into the structures. It's just the structures now filtering through a concrete history. that leads to a diversity of outcome, some of which could be totally just, but some of which could not be just. Like if there is a child who is born in a very difficult situation that is a result of some sins, I would say that's an injustice that I would want to fix. And I can't say, oh, the equal application of the law applies to this kid as much to the kid who's born in the nice situation. It's all his fault. No, 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 no. We've got to do more than just have good laws. And so, but don't say the problem is with the law. The problem is with us needing to fix certain particular situations. Now, what might be more controversial for a more conservative position on this regard is that I'm also open to the possibility that there might be just biological phenomenon that we're less aware of that could be more engaged than we'd like to think. So there's in-group, out-group biases, and if there's something true to evolutionary psychology, and it's difficult to evaluate a lot of these things because they could be agenda-driven and so on and so forth. But at least a priori, it kind of makes sense to me that the animal would be conditioned to recognize friend and foe, what is in my in-group, what is not in my in-group, and therefore out-group. And it just wouldn't surprise me if we have in our brains something like that, where people who look like me, I'm at least instinctively, biologically more open to friendship with. In my own personal experience and seeing many other people, those things can be so easily overcome that sometimes it makes me wonder, does that really exist at the level of at least skin tone? If I see an alien with like 4 arms, maybe that's going to trigger my outgroup bias, from my lizard brain. But if I see somebody with a different skin tone, maybe that won't. I don't know, but I'm at least open to the possibility that I might have, physiologically a different reaction to somebody who looks different than me. And that if I see somebody, take the stereotypical guy with the baggy jeans late at night with the hoodie walking down, I might, for good reason, looking at statistics or looking at, whatever arguments, say, oh, there is a percentage of possibility that this person might be more dangerous than a person who didn't have a hoodie and was wearing slacks and a tie. But maybe not. There's also the possibility that the guy in slacks is the coke dealer who's driving up in the fancy car or whatever. So like you can't jump to a definitive conclusion, but you can, if we're allowing ourselves to reason on the basis of statistics and probabilities, have more of a fear of one person than the other. So I don't want to discount that as oh, you irrational, mean racist. It's like, no, I'm just looking at probabilities like we do in so many other forms of reasoning. If anybody ever passes to a definitive judgment, then I would seriously balk. And I would also always want to be sure that I'm checking that suspicion, because I don't want to allow a suspicion to close me off to the possibility that this person is new or this person breaks my expectation. I must be like that or I'll never grow. But yeah, so I don't know. To me, it seems very complex, and I want to try to think openly. But also reasonably. Should I go to the right stuff, the stuff about the right, or
I mean, if you can, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm impressed that you're able to. I'm impressed that you're able to do so. But if you can, please, yes.
So, if I understood right, the right objects to the idea that I must be responsible for everything. They would say it is possible to be unfairly held responsible for a misfortune. And I think that's true. I think both just rationally, if you just look at an individual's resources, he can't feed 7 billion, right? And then just theologically, I am not Jesus Christ. I cannot redeem all mankind from its sin and slavery. And death. So yeah, that just seems to me a pretty obvious premise. And so the question is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Well, whom are you supposed to help? And whom has God put in your circle as a neighbor? Or who has he invited you to go make your neighbor? But I would also challenge the right here. I would say, don't see this as such a burden. Like, at least if you're, conservative and Christian, like, get excited. This is what we're here for, to like participate in Jesus's mission of reconciling all things to the Father, building a civilization of love. Like, are you really thinking that you are going to find your satisfaction in the private enjoyment of whatever wealth or goods or talent that you've been gifted with? If you're a Christian, you will say, no, I find my life by losing it. I am like a seed that falls to the ground, dies, and bears fruit. That's where I find my union and friendship with Jesus Christ and find my place in his mystical body, doing his incredible work in the world. So the right's inclination, to really balk, like, okay, I'll help, but only where I really have to, and I'm really trying to protect this area where you can't oblige me to help. It's like, why are you so concerned for that? It should be a question of like, where everywhere am I supposed to live for love?
I think, though, that the perception on the right is that I'm being told I'm responsible when I'm not.
Hmm.
I think many on the right probably would be very charitable and are very charitable, but they don't like to be held responsible for things they're not responsible for. And they view that as very aggressive and wrong on the
Yeah.
part of those doing so. And that actually creates probably a desire not to provide help, which may also be wrong. But I just wanted to articulate that.
Yeah, no, and that's good. And I think that kind of leads to your last point earlier about how people can use or instrumentalize the idea of responsibility to promote their own selfish agendas, or at least in
Mhm.
good faith, but particular agendas that aren't actually obliged in justice, but just what they want to see done. That I think can happen. And so if what you're saying is the position I'm responding to, then I would say, yeah, let's be prepared for a lot of people to be in fact wrong when they try to tell us what our vocation is. Like ultimately I'm going to stand before God. Was I faithful to what he called me to do? And there's a measure in which my vocation is accessible to all thinking people and all believing people. But there's a whole host of particulars that stand between, God and my own conscience. There's a line I love in Revelation is that, that God will give to each person who perseveres a white stone on which a name is written that no one else knows. I think this is written in like Revelation 12 or something. And I like thinking of that as a vocation. It's a name that no one else knows but him who receives it. And it's also a building block, something that you offer to building up the heavenly Jerusalem. And so there could certainly be an area of things where people should say, hey, you, like everyone else, insofar as you're a human being, insofar as you're a citizen of this country, owe something. But then there's another level of, well, hey, and so is your John. I can't tell you everything that you could owe, because a lot of that is in your discernment of your vocation in the mystical body. And I think certainly if we're Catholic, or if we have any kind of personalist philosophy where we recognize the importance of freedom for personal dignity, and that our fulfillment as human beings is in the exercise of that freedom, and we're not just cogs in an economic or social justice wheel, then we have to be ready for that give and take back and forth. And sometimes those people who are asking more of us might be right, and we should listen to them. But I don't think they would have the right to force us on a number of things. And they always need to be self-examining about whether or not they're honest with themselves about, is what I'm promoting actually the common good? Or am I just trying to mask my own agenda or favorite project as if it were the common good?